Hi guys, we are back, y'all, for American History of Visual Encyclopedia pages 92 to 95. And so if you open up your pages there, we've got a picture of a family of settlers that is posing in front of their sod house in the Nebraska prairie. Remember, we learned about how these settlers would move over and they would have to make the land work for them in order to get to win their land, right? So they'd have like 5 years to make the land work for them. And homesteaders, they worked hard to make a living off their land, where just some of the Americans moved out west to settle the frontier. Cowboys and railroad workers found plenty of work, but American Indians, the original residents of these lands, had to fight to defend their way of life. And there's a timeline there on the bottom you're welcome to look at a little bit closer. But that is the first page, that's 92. And then 93 is the other sort of half of that page. And this is the, kind of the introduction to this chapter. That's the rest of that photo. So Americans have always been, from 1869 to 1900, Americans have always been a frontier people living on the edge of the unknown. In the late 19th century, the frontier was the area that had been bypassed in the rush to the Pacific earlier in the century. Ranchers and cowboys moved north into the frontier from Texas to be closer to the railheads that shipped cattle east. Homesteaders and sheep ranchers settled these lands too, using new farming technology to overcome difficult conditions. And miners ventured into the Rocky Mountains in search of gold and silver. This expansion threatened American Indians, especially the Plains tribes who lived by hunting the roaming buffalo herds. Some tribes fought to save their land, but by the late 1870s, all the tribes have been forced onto reservations. And that is it is really sad when you think about it, that all these Indians were forced off the land. In 1890, the U.S. Census reported that the frontier was closed to settlement. So by 1890, you couldn't come over and get land and resettle anymore. You had to have done it before 1890. Okay, so page 94, we've got railroads. And we talked about this in our other book. So this just kind of reinforces what we were talking about in the other textbook. So westward expansion happened slowly before the Transcontinental Railroad was established. So before there was a railroad, it was slow getting out to the west. It had been a goal of politicians, businessmen, and many ordinary Americans to have a network of railroads that would link the coasts of the United States. Once the system was in place, ranchers could ship herds of cattle north and east for big profits. Manufactured goods could easily be sent to new towns in the west, and all could travel around the country at a fraction of the time and the money it had cost before. There was also this really cool thing that I'm sure you guys have heard about before called the Pony Express. And from 1860 to 1862, the Pony Express operated as a mail service between San Francisco, California, and St. Joseph, Missouri, with the U.S. Postal Service carrying the mail east from there. So the Pony Express would help get the mail all the way to Missouri, and then the U.S. Postal Service would take over and then distribute the mail. So because it was so far west, it was really hard to do mail. People were captivated by the image of brave riders speeding alone along the landscape, leaping onto fresh horses at every 10-mile station until they had completed their 200 miles. So this Pony Express is really cool, right? They'd ride for 10 miles, they'd get a fresh horse. 10 miles, get a fresh horse. And then they would complete their 200 miles. It was fast. It only took 8 days to get a letter from San Francisco. But it was stopped when the first transcontinental telegraph line was completed in 1862. So once you had the telegraph, they no longer did the mail. And then building the railroads, May 10, 1869, in Promontory, Utah, a golden railroad spike was hammered into place, joining the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific Railroads and completing a continuous track across the country. The Transcontinental Railroad flowed the natural path of waterways, but it required laborers to level the terrain and blast passages through the mountains. 4 more railroads and dozens of feeder lines followed rapidly. The government gave the railroad companies large tracts of land on either side of the lines for sale to the settlers, or land companies promoted the quick development in the West. So here's a picture where the rails were joined during a ceremony in Utah in 1869. Were 20,000 workers who labored on the Transcontinental Railroad, including European and Chinese immigrants, as well as Civil War veterans. The Chinese who had immigrated across the Pacific to California, so they came the other way, right? They didn't come from the east like Europeans would. They came the other way and ended up in California. Made up about half the workforce. They were made to do the most dangerous work and were paid less than the other workers. In general, the work was hard. 12-hour days were common, and Indian attacks were a danger since buffalo hunting grounds were being ruined by the growing network of tracks. Railroad owners were powerful men who could ignore workers' demands for more money and better conditions because they had enough workers. They'd be like, if you don't like it, leave. I'll get another worker that'll do it for the price that I want you to do it for. And then page 95, we've got, it's kind of a cool looking page here because in the top left, you got a Union Pacific poster that's advertising all the rail travel. And shooting buffaloes from trains became a cruel sport. So the great herds were seen as hindrances. So they would just shoot them from the trains and they wouldn't even eat it. And then tanning companies would send teams of hunters to kill the animals for the hides, leaving the meat to rot, which is just awful. Before the expansion of the railroads, trips between the coasts were made by stagecoach around South America by ship or across the Isthmus of Panama. These expensive routes took weeks. By train, the trip could be made in 5 days for a cost of only $150. Early train travel was uncomfortable and slowed by frequent transfers and stops at meal stations. As railroads grew and train designs improved, passengers did not have to switch trains so often, and food was served on board. The connections between cars were enclosed so that passengers could move throughout the train from car to car. This also improved ventilation, so windows could be shut and passengers, many of whom were traveling to visit family, no longer arrived covered in dirt. Although cheap accommodations did exist, almost all traveled first class. A first-class trip from New York to Chicago only cost $5. And look, there's actually a sleeping car. They had seats and curtained sleeping compartments. George Pullman saw a need for more comfortable train cars with both day and night accommodations, and so he had electric lights, steam heat, and leather seats. Pullman founded one of the company's first towns, Pullman, Illinois, where he owned the houses, shops, and even the church. In 1894, the workers, angry that they were in debt to Pullman stores and working for low wages, went on strike. Though unsuccessful, their effort was supported by railroad workers across the United States. And we'll talk more about that in future chapters, but this would include the Pony Express in your timeline, Zoe, from 1860 to 62, and the Transcontinental Railroad being completed in 1869. So Americans were moving west, of course, to homestead and to mine. But the railroad, we really needed the railroad to link the coasts of the U.S. so that ranchers could ship their herds of cattle, manufactured goods could go all over the United States, and people could travel around the country faster and cheaper. So there may be a few other videos on this. I think I'd like to put something about the Transcontinental Railroad, so do whatever the assignment says.